What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Barbara Oliveira, and we speak about facilitating in high-level multi-stakeholder spaces with a focus on climate futures and climate action. And we really dive into the processes, how to facilitate the change that is needed to save this planet. So listen carefully, because this is an episode not to miss. And don't forget to scroll to the show notes to find more links to connect to Barbara and to subscribe to the show if you feel like it. Thank you for listening. Hello, Barbara. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. I am super curious to speak with you and to hear about multi-stakeholder meetings, high stakes, climate action, all these big topics that are more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, and we're having this talk just in the aftermath of the COP29, which ended this weekend, which is quite interesting, quite timely as well.
Yes, so we are recording this end of November 2024.
Yeah.
And before we go there, I will start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah. So I do call myself a facilitator, and I think I started calling myself a facilitator back in 2009. I don't know exactly when or which meeting, but I remember introducing myself as a facilitator or somebody who just, create opportunities for people who are very different to meet somewhere that feels productive and comfortable enough to go further.
Yeah. Sounds like a guide.
Yeah. I had this retreat with my consensus building community a few months ago, and one of our colleagues, friends, beautiful person, asked the question, which tool are you as a facilitator and mediator? And we all, took that question overnight, and I came back the next day. I think I'm a torch. I see myself like shedding light when it's dark, and sometimes a lighthouse, when participants are in their boats trying to get somewhere. I'm in the shore, showing the rocks and saying, hey, keep on going, keep on going. Yeah, but definitely the idea of like a guide or a torch resonates with me a lot.
And I love that. I love that image you're painting, because they know, for me, it sounds like they know the way and what it takes, so they can navigate the boat. But if they don't see, they will navigate in the wrong direction. So you're not telling them where to go or what to do, but you're helping them to see so that they can do the work.
Yeah, exactly. I think as a facilitator doing this work for almost 15 years now, the one thing that has grown inside of myself is really this trust for groups. I come from the art of hosting school of facilitation, besides working formal multi-stakeholder negotiation processes. And there is that innate trust in the wisdom of groups. And what happens is what, the only thing that could have happened. Yeah. And I remember learning that trust a group, trust a group, trust a group. And I'm a lawyer by training. I was like, what are you talking about? I just plan 3 versions of an agenda and think of every possible pitfall and, plan for troubleshooting all kinds of different things that could go wrong. And so seeing myself as a lighthouse or a torch, trusting that these are the navigators, they are in the boat together. I'm not a captain. I'm not even part of the boat. I can be invited for coffee or tea, but they know where they're heading. And sometimes the lighthouse also helps them see that maybe the direction they're going is not the most useful, or they thought they wanted to go that way, but maybe they want to stop sooner, or maybe they want to divert course. And that's also part of it. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I heard 3 kind of keywords that I would love to double click on. One is, and I first list them all 3, and then maybe you see where you want to start.
Sounds good.
I heard you've been a lawyer before, and you started, or you're coming from the school of thought of the art of hosting, and you're part of the consensus building community.
Yeah.
And I wonder how these 3 aspects inform the work that you're doing today with these complex multi-stakeholder meetings, especially maybe as a lawyer that is paid to have answers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the art of hosting, of creating space and hosting sounds more comfortable and cozy than multi-stakeholder meeting for climate action.
Yeah.
And consensus building, is it always about consensus?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the pitfalls?
Yeah.
So these are my three big ones, and I just drop them there and leave it to you where to go with it.
Yeah, how to make sense of them. So I love how you elaborated on this, because for me now, I think I'm at a place, again, I'm almost 48 years old. I've been doing this for 1.5 decades, working in different countries with different communities, tackling different wicked problems between climate change, biodiversity, conservation, energy transitions. Yeah, so I think I came to a place in which I feel really integrated and whole. But for a while, in the beginning, in the first, let's say, until 2012, maybe, I felt very torn, I guess, because I felt like I was a double agent. Sometimes I was hanging out with the Art of Hosting, the Impact Hub, the Innovation Crowd, doing World Cafes. And it's all like wonderful and so connecting and so creative. But then how do we follow through from this? What are the action points and what are we implementing? And of course, even in the Art of Hosting, there is a lot of consistency in implementation and pro-action cafes, and we've gone a long way. And then I would, the next day or the next weekend, I'm sitting with the consensus building folks, and we are designing a whole year process to develop policy scenarios for energy investment at a country level. And then it's all very formal, and the agendas are like really tight, and there is barely any space for the individual. It's all like, what is the structure? What is the mandate? What is the negotiation mandate? And what are the different positions? And what are the interests? And where are we landing? And what is the policy goal? And how is the policy going to be implemented? And I was fine being this double agent and just, wearing one hat one day and another hat the other day, and having the legal background, which has always been super helpful because it's so analytical, and I'm always asking questions and not settling for the first answer and wanting to know why and tell me more. And what if we do it this way? And then I think when I became a coach, an integral coach in 2015, things started to come together. And then I started cross-fertilizing in the communities. And then I became the connecting or the connection expert in the consensus building community. And I became like the designer and the big vision scenario development person in the Art of Hosting community. And that was really a beautiful cross-fertilization in terms of the tools and mindsets that the different schools of thought and facilitation contribute to actually tackling the hardest problems or challenges in our time.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for helping us to understand this web and how it all came together. And I think it just beautifully also shows how facilitators all bring in their different paths to then help groups in very different ways. Yeah. And maybe you can tell us more about your work with multi-stakeholders to tackle these big problems of our times, like climate change. And you mentioned another keyword that may inspire your answer, the position roles and the little space for individuals. So we have multi-stakeholders, and they're all representing organizations, countries, institutions. And I wonder, as facilitators, we all say connection over content. And we first have to connect on the heart level before we can go into the hard conversations and before we can even dream of consensus. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's so interesting when you're talking about consensus and like connection. And well, I don't think I've ever shared that with you in our conversations, but I started at the UN. I worked at the UN level. And the reason why I think I found my way into facilitation is because I was working in Geneva. And I was sitting through these multilateral meetings with all the, the states represented and discussing agenda items and all of that. And I'm one of those kids that when I was in school or at university, my goal was to save the world and work at the UN. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yes,
there are those kids.
yes, I can relate to that.
And so I'm there, like really happy. I've made it. I'm in Geneva. This is incredible, amazing. And I'm sitting through these meetings and I'm thinking, if these are the people who are going to save the world, we are doomed. Like there is no way in these ways of having a conversation, there is no way that we're going to generate the types of like results and outcomes that really address where we are now. Maybe they did address in the 1950s. There is such an important role for the UN in building peace and like bringing hope in a world that's devastated by war. 2 wars, one after the other, all the regional wars. So there's something revolutionary in a multilateral body in that. But this is 2000 and back then, 2006, 2007. And this is like the internet coming online and we're talking like there were 30 years of participatory policy development happening in the US, since the 1970s, 1980s. The re-democratized countries also having participatory fora for policy development. So I was like, this is not, there must be another way of doing this, right?
Mm.
So fast forward 2 years, I'm in this training in the Netherlands, where I live now. And it was called the International Program for the Management of Sustainability. And it was a 1-week intensive learning how to do interest-based negotiations, or the Harvard method on negotiations. And it was all about, instead of reading your statement or your position from your country, let's just understand what is at stake, what are the goals, and how can we get there? And how do we look at each other as resources versus a burden to overcome? So I think that really informed even then my lawyering, or how I saw things. Instead of seeing others as adversaries, it's like they are part of the problem, they are part of the solution for sure. Let's see what each one brings to the table and let's figure this out. We may even disagree what the problem is. We can still find a way to agree on the solution.
And what I hear is a massive mindset shift from a lawyer who's usually playing, I would say, a zero-sum game, where one loses, one wins.
Yeah.
At least that's, I think, the ambition of a lawyer going into court.
Yeah, a litigator, for sure. Yeah.
To suddenly looking for solutions where everyone can win.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it also comes from a value system. So because I grew up in that mindset, that the kid wants to save the world and work at the UN, from day one in law school, I found the whole idea of me having to win. For me to win, you have to lose very strange. So I was like, well, why would I do that? And I didn't have words for those things, or I couldn't name it, but it's like, I want to preserve the relationship as well. And I remember all my civil procedure or criminal procedure teachers, this just saying, you don't need to negotiate on this. You're going to win. Like the law is on your side, the decisions on the court, jurisprudence on your side. I said, but I don't want to win. I want to solve the problem. It's a different thing. And I want to have it solved for a long time, like to keep nurturing this. So moving, even as, as facilitators, we have such an important role helping participants also move from a zero-sum game thinking into, a win-win or value creation. People say, oh, win-win is too naive. Okay, great. A value creation mindset, is there value to be created? What are you bringing? What am I bringing? Let's just expand this and I'll meet my goals by allowing you to meet your goals.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? What do you think?
Yeah. I can totally see the mindset shift and the desire to do that. And now I wonder, how can this become possible? Because on the small scale, yes, I can see it happening in workshops with the individuals at the organizational levels. And now you make me even more curious how this works on a global scale with multilateral negotiations or conversations where, and I think especially for climate, everyone comes in with, yes, of course, we have the same goal, want to save the climate. And for everyone, something different is at stake.
Mm.
And the costs are not equally distributed.
Yeah. I would put a question mark after the question. Do we have the same goal? Like, I don't like, oh my God, this is such a huge, so many things to, untie there. I find there are various levels of divergence in the climate conversation. So we are dealing with the tension between short-term and long-term action. One of the most entrenched discussions in international law, which is the common but differentiated responsibilities or the historical responsibility for the emissions, and who pays the bill is another big question, right? What is the equity versus equality issue? If I were to look at the negotiations, not from a legal perspective and all the issues I've just described, but from a process perspective and how conversations are organized, I noticed that there is a lot of space for discussing losses and people giving up things and how much is that going to cost. And more like, how much does it cost to adapt, not only to give up fossil fuels or to give up our ways of living, but also how much does it cost to adapt and to transition into a new way of living, and the compensation for those who have suffered the losses or are in danger because of the climate changing. And I wonder, where is the space for the visioning? Like, I don't remember the last climate conversation that I was in a more formal setting, that there was a 1.5 hour introduction. So let's all envision a world in which we've made it. We've made it. Like, we were together. Look at the person sitting by your side. This person made it with you. Like, and you were together and you made it happen. How does this world look like? And of course, there are many people working on this, but I'm talking about where decisions are being made. And from that vision, that unifying vision with some differences, maybe, we walk backwards and say, okay, so what had to happen when, by when, and how? And then a discussion on trade-offs. And for that discussion is a facilitated discussion with modelists, and you're an economist, so run the models and let's look at the trade-offs, and not only economic costs, but social costs, environmental costs, cultural costs. And then let's discuss, what are the criteria for making decisions? Is it equity? Is it ancestral knowledge? Is it cultural, protecting cultural heritage? Is it the options that protect future generations the most? And then we're not discussing the criteria, only negotiating a tit for tat bunch of solutions. So at the multilateral level, it would be incredible for that to happen, but that can already happen in the country level, in regional levels, among states that have commonalities, like the EU, for example. And that is the work that I have been doing for many years, also developing those scenarios, or not developing, helping those scenarios be developed for people to have those conversations.
Yeah. And what I hear in what you describe, thank you so much for guiding us through that. I had a lot of light bulb moments. And one specifically is that by boiling it down to a process level, you're taking the emotional load out of the conversation, where it's not about who pays what and who has suffered and who is defending their own stakes, but it's, okay, what are the common denominators and what are the criteria we want to agree upon? And to have set that first, and then go into the models and look at the data and say, okay, if we agree on the vision and the main criteria, what does it then mean? And how can we negotiate then the implementation and the details?
Yeah. I think you're spot on to make it more workable. You're trying to make something huge and very complex, and according to some intractable, workable. And I wouldn't say that the emotions do not belong. I would just say that then they would have like a place for that to be welcomed, like they're not something that gets mixed up with the conversation that there is no money available, but, I'm drowning, my island is going to disappear. And then the person says, well, great, but it would cost 5 billion and I only have 200 million available. I mean, what kind of conversation is that,
Yeah.
Like, okay, so if that is going to likely happen, what are we going to do about that? What is our vision of how? Then we're going to talk about migration and all kinds of different things, but we are on this together. Like, my job is not to fend you off. My job is to think through with you and commit to this vision together. But emotions are very, very important. And I think if well explored and well, how is the word facilitated? Let's just see where it lands us.
Contained? Oh, yeah, facilitated.
Yeah, contained in a positive way, not like suppressed or repressed, but they have a container.
In a container.
It's well held. They lead us to needs. They lead us to what are the needs behind these emotions. They lead us to grievances. Where have we not abide by our values? Where have we not abide by these principles we've just discussed? And so that is a real conversation as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. And I would love to come back to the emotions and to the individuals who actually sit there. And before that, just one more moment on the process, because as you explained all the implications of, okay, the island might disappear. Okay, we don't have enough budget. And then we have the issues of migration. We have the issues of cultural heritage, of shared responsibility. It seems so what I can connect it to is an organization that sees one issue, that they're losing market share, whatever. And then a consultant comes in, or a facilitator, and peels the onion and actually shows everything that is related to that. And while everyone is focused to just solve this one problem, how can we save the island? Suddenly, you have the conversation about values, priorities, systems, evaluation methods. Who decides, or how does it then come? Because it almost looks like a flowchart.
Yeah.
That you want to go back to the highest level as possible to really start there, and then go down and to discuss the next level whenever it's appropriate, and that you can only discuss when you have agreed upon the higher levels. And I can imagine, from what I observe in human dynamics, is that's far too complex. Let's talk about the budget again.
Yes.
Because it's so much easier. But then you have to constantly get them on the road and put them up on the meta level again. So how does it work?
Yeah. Well, oh my God, you've just nailed. First, now I have a light bulb here. And I was like, yeah, that's a very good question. Who is framing these things? And I think I'm going to go into that in 1 second. So I'm thinking, oh, that's such a beautiful question. The other thing is, like, you've been working on complexity for decades now, right? As an economist, as a facilitator. And we know all the heuristics of like how the human mind shies away from complexity, how we try to break down the parts and simplify things. And that is why I strongly advocate for facilitation, professional facilitation in such processes. The facilitator is a key instrument for holding complexity, or creating ways for complexity to be a little more digestible for the groups, or less scary, or so there is something about holding that complexity. And I know you want to go there. So where is the individual on this? Where is the human development on this? And let's talk about that as well, because it's the one thing that started keeping me awake at night over the last 5 years. Like, where does trauma come into these conversations? Am I hosting conversations with a bunch of people who are completely numb? They're not listening. The people are saying, I don't have a home anymore because of the torrential rain and landslides. And they're like, oh, okay, great. Next. People are completely numb. So either we go like, this is about power, they don't care about us, or we're just like, oh my God, they are numb. We should have an intervention for a bunch of somatic experienced therapists to help people come out of their hypoarousal window, of tolerance, the lack of tolerance. But anyway, so we were talking about, so you mentioned about the
who's holding the process,
who frames it, and then you asked me something else. You said there was a piece about framing, and the other piece was about, because I said I'm going to start with that.
It slipped because now you caught me on the trauma.
Yeah, we want there. So never mind. So we just start with the beginning, okay? That's why I find negotiations skills and negotiations theory so vital for this type of facilitation. Whoever frames the conversation holds a lot of power. And whoever holds a lot of power ends up framing the conversation. So I advocate for participatory processes at the country level, at the UN level, at the multi-state, like when you think of intergovernmental levels, so that the framing of these conversations can be revisited. Because by now we're having conversations, let's say, around climate change in the international fora that follows a structure that was negotiated in 1992 when the world was very different, and then revised, 2004, and then 2008, and then 2015, and then, but there is a whole framing that was done by experts in climate policy, plus the UN Secretariat, plus the states that have negotiated the frame. That's why it's called the framework agreement, in which we keep developing things. And with the amount of climate data we have, the types of interests that different groups that do not participate at the governmental level have, we're talking about youth, unborn generations, elderly, those in marginalized communities, those in the most vulnerable countries and areas, in which I would say, well, good question. Let's just reframe this conversation and see where we end, right? And that there is a lot of, that's when loss and damage came in and the conversation around equity. And there is another thing, which is the anchoring effect in negotiations. So whoever puts the first proposal or make the first step is anchoring on numbers, on ambition, on how much you invest. So I'd say that maybe, well, there has been, 30 years that we've been having these conversations at the multilateral level. And I wonder if it's time for a reset. Yeah. I hadn't thought about this. I told you, let's discuss where we can facilitate these conversations, because the multilateral negotiations level is not one that has been really, it has a lot of chairing, but not facilitation as we call it with the capital F, where people connect and we think of vision and we share our fears and we mourn together and we grieve and we dream. It's been very formal around positions, and a lot more collaboration and participatory policy development happens in countries and local government level.
And that's a very interesting aspect. Do you think it is because of a lack of understanding a facilitator could bring to the process, so that they don't believe maybe in the competence or expertise or in the potential value a facilitator could bring? Or is it because the system is so much in the mindset of negotiating and zero sum that there's a lack of trust that who appoints this facilitator, who will then again have a lot of power? Because if you drive the process, if you hold the framework, there's a lot of trust. There's a lot of power as well, even if you don't define what happens within that.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. It's a good point. I think that the intergovernmental regimes, they're really founded in state sovereignty. So in that sense, the chair is one of the one representative of a state. So they're among peers. And it's a system that's been done in diplomacy since a long time. So if you think of mediation, popes used to mediate conflicts like 1,000 years ago. So it's a peer system. And I know of different processes in which chairs have hired facilitators as support, and the facilitator is more on the background. And they're like helping ask good questions, ask powerful questions, create some moments of interaction that is more informal. But I remember doing things for international organizations at the national level. They have, like, everything is on record. There is no brainstorming. All statements are read and recorded. So when you frame this conversation as like multi-stakeholder processes, high-stake conversations, is because everything is on record. So where is the space for just creative thinking and, as we say, in interest-based negotiations, like, creating without committing and analyzing the various possibilities? What is the value that different parties are bringing to the table before you actually go into agreement negotiations?
Yeah. And then what is the role of the individual as opposed to the role? Because I can imagine from what you explain now, everything has been preset. So every individual is representing their organization, their institution, their country. So they're coming in carrying the responsibility to represent as best as they can. So there's, from what I understand or how I imagine it, very little wiggle room. So if they're invited to brainstorm, this means letting go of this army of people who have been involved in preparing the representative and then starting and basically putting the trust in this representative that they can be in the moment and develop to the best of their knowledge representing everyone.
Yeah. And usually those positions are the outcome of like very tight negotiations at home as well. If you think of the person who represents the European Union, like, 26 states have sat down and spent months trying to come to that one position. So they have very little leeway. And that's where the innovation happens, not in that form. It happens before, it happens in Brussels, it happens in a multi-stakeholder forum on energy or energy transitions for the European landscape, or places where you can really gather industry and academia and youth groups and government representatives and CSOs to look the way I was describing before. What is the vision? Where do we want to be together? And what are the pieces, the parts of the puzzles that each one of us are bringing to make that a reality? And how are we going to deal with trade-offs? Because there is no free lunch. So there is no way that change will not affect different groups, that will change the way businesses are done, and that is a whole different, like a expanded conversation into how we're framing the future as well, and decolonization and all of that. Yeah. I wonder what is the facilitation hook in that? Because I think one of the roles we have as facilitators is also to explicit those values, the values that inform the different worldviews. There is so much conversation and discourse that's based on automatism and things that we're repeating and we don't know because it's the buzzword that's on LinkedIn or on the latest report of this organization or that organization. And I think having worked with different like minorities and different groups, like indigenous groups, women rights groups, there is always that question, what is this in service of? What is this narrative? What is behind this narrative? And there is sometimes even when we talk about building futures, there is such an imprint of business as usual. We're going to change the way we produce, but we're not going to change consumption levels. We're not going to change how we deal with the end of life product. And that's still why I think multi-stakeholder collaboration is so important, because that's when those questions will be asked.
Yeah, they will be asked. And then the question is, how much space for innovation is there then in the conversation if there is no time to pause, to bring everything on one level up on the meta level to assess, okay, what are the values or the principles that we derive this conversation from? And I wonder what you would think, what kind of principles would have to change so that it might become possible to actually shift gears and to, maybe it's a wrong word, but empower the representatives so that they can engage in more innovative conversations.
Yeah, I'm so loving it that we arrived at the conversation on principles and values. And I know you've had other guests in this podcast that talked about principle-based facilitation. And I find making those values explicit and working through polarity management, for example, in which we're looking, if we make a decision in this situation under these values, what does it look like? Under those values, what does it look like? So is there, a third, and that is not a conversation about values in abstract. It's like, these are the colors in which we interpret this way of being. And I would say, this is me going back kind of with my legal DNA or the legal, it's like the river, right? The underwater.
Undercurrent.
Yeah, the undercurrent. I can come out of the legal profession, but it doesn't leave me necessarily. So I think the one principle that I have been holding very dear to my heart is the intergenerational piece. And what does it mean to make decisions now that will protect life on the planet 7 generations from now? So this is the work that colleagues at CL done with a bunch of other beautiful organizations called the Maastricht Principles, the rights of future generations. And I think anything that I sit down and facilitate, and if I'm able to offer that, I'm not the one, I'm offering the principles. Or maybe in the contract phase, like, what are you discussing here? What are you making decisions based on? I would find that if we're talking about equity, those principles are the ones to be holding dear when we're having these discussions at whatever level we're talking.
And I was reflecting on guiding principles and values a lot recently as we closed with the last NDB festival, and realizing that we had 3 guiding principles: risk, respect, and generosity. And everything that has evolved came out of these guiding principles. And realizing the wasted opportunity of many organizations by just putting the principles or their values on the wall, but not nurturing them in a way that they are driving decision-making and facilitating decision-making.
Yeah.
To what extent are the principles then on this higher level present, or also just words on the wall?
Yeah. In the climate regime, in the climate negotiations, most of the principles, they are in the preamble to the agreement, to the UNFCCC agreement. And as a policymaker and a lawyer, you study those things. So every preamble to an agreement, this is, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. This is me back at my, public international law when I was a teacher still. So I'm laughing here. I was like, these things don't leave my body. Anyway, so you always interpret an agreement, an international agreement, in light to the preamble and the principles therein. And international law itself has many principles as well that are aimed at protecting life and keeping peace and all of those things. So we're not in lack of principles, No. They are there. They have been well designed. They can be reinterpreted in light of the world we live in now, which is a decolonial world in which we're talking about equity in a very different way, in which we're talking about repairing historical harm. And that leads us to the individual. Is like, how can we prepare the people who participate in these processes to be resilient for these conversations? And that's where I see, so I've talked about the facilitator as a negotiator, right? And now I want to talk about the facilitator as a coach. And how can facilitators work with colleagues that are able to create spaces that are safe enough for inner transformation, brave enough for exploring what's on the undercurrent, but safe enough for inner transformation. And also our ability to hold both what's at the surface and what are the outcomes and the decisions that are being made, and what is in this individual collective, because it's collective trauma, but individual collective layer. Yeah.
And it's the second time that you use the word trauma, so I would love to double click on that. And also I realized that I'm very peculiar on words today.
Yeah.
On resilience. What do you mean by resilience, to prepare them to build the resilience? Is it because of the frustration that comes through these conversations and that they have to stick to their vision and the purpose why they showed up in the first place? Or what is the resilience about?
So, Miriam, in the facilitations you lead, when people are not interested in the conversation or they can't cope with the conversation, what do? What do you see them doing?
They disturb. They withdraw, disturb. Why are we talking about that? There's no sense in this anyway. They leave. Or they start discussing about something that is granular and tangible to divert the conversation. It's my experience.
Exactly. In my experience in these settings, they just check out. Sometimes they check out because they have another negotiation forum that they can get things done. Or they check out because they feel they're very powerful, so they don't need to be engaged in this. They don't actually need this to happen. Or they check out because they're way too busy and this is too much and let's not engage with this, right? So if you have participants that are still disturbing you, are the lucky ones because they're still active and their energy is in the room. So I think when I was discussing, like when I brought the idea of resilience, what I was referring to is creating a space in which people are still able to self-regulate and co-regulate, so that when discussions get uncomfortable, let's say we're talking about energy transition and it was all about megawatts generation. And all of a sudden there is a group that says, yeah, but you're actually Brazil, for example, you're generating all the energy in the north and we are indigenous peoples and we live in the north and we don't have electricity because all the electricity goes to the south. So it's generated there, but it doesn't stay there. So we have an equity issue. What does a person in a position of power would do is like, oh yeah, that's very interesting, but it's not my domain. I don't do energy policy. I'm just here talking about energy generation. Or they'll say, oh, thank you for saying that, and they move on to something. And resilience allows me to be present, to self-regulate, to feel if I feel like, ouch, and there is an arrow coming through me. I was like, really, tell me more. I'm so sorry that's your experience. So, wow, there is an issue here. Where are we generating the energy and where is the energy arriving? And how equitable is that? So let's put it on the wall as a theme. It's not mine. I'm just the energy company. Why would I put that on the wall? But there is this sense that what is in the space belongs to all of us. It's not only my point or their point. And as a facilitator, I can just help make them on the wall and land on the wall very elegantly and swiftly, instead of saying, well, but the energy company said, I can just say, oh, that, thank you so much for highlighting that, John. So it's a person, not the hat anymore. And I just put that on the wall.
And that's where the neutrality comes in. That's so important in a facilitator.
Yeah.
And you spoke about trauma. And I think there are many levels of trauma. And I 2 podcast episodes recently also about different levels of trauma-informed facilitation, trauma-informed design. And now we are speaking about collective trauma, I assume.
Yes.
Populations of countries.
Yeah.
How does this play a role, and how can you take this into account in this context as a facilitator?
Yeah. So if you hear colleagues in the trauma fields speaking, especially this year, they keep saying how like climate change is the biggest manifestation of collective trauma, right? Thomas Hobel says that. And it's like there is so much hurt and so much grief that has not been lived through and named, that we're basically just destroying the planet through our inability to absorb new information, to relate to others, to find common ground, to care for the planet. So I stay either on reactivity, anger, fighting, or flight, or I'm numb. And meanwhile, right, the planet is burning. And so if we look at this from this perspective, and also decolonization and the historical grievances that are really showing up now as we talk about the climate impacts, I find that like healthy conversations around climate, even if it's energy policy or transportation policy, include our grief, our collective grief. Grief as to how inept we've been to deal with this, or how we've adopted ways of production, producing, consuming that landed us in the place where we are now. But it doesn't end there. That's why I said the conversation doesn't end in emotions or grieving. There is the role of beauty in transforming that, in transcending that. So I find that in highly charged conversations in policy development with very diverse groups, slowing down is a trauma-informed approach. Slowing down for people to meet each other, having good food, having beauty, bringing art.
Caring for the body.
Yeah, care for the body. Is it a comfortable chair? Are we sitting outside enough? Many intergovernmental negotiations happen in rooms without windows. Like, how can you create any beauty out of that? So it's so like, if you go back to the process as a place, so place as part of process, where are we meeting? Are we honoring the traditions of that place? Do we have enough time for storytelling? Do we start with somebody opening? For example, I hosted a bioeconomy summit a year ago in Brazil with all the Amazonian countries. And I told them from the beginning, this is sacred land. So let's invite indigenous groups to open for us. And at the beginning, I think people thought, yeah, they're going to say, hey, welcome, on behalf of our land. And then, of course, the idea is that the indigenous groups would open in their way. So they open in a way that they would sing and dance and invoke ancestrals. And the beginning was an opening speech format. So it had 15 minutes on the agenda, but the opening, the ways that those people opened took 1.5 hours. And it's just the way it is. And that is part of the slowing down, you know? And it was such a beautiful summit in which the organizers invite Amazonian artists to display their art. And there were women, indigenous women painters who had their painting exhibited. And so you think, oh, but that's so small compared to all we have to catch up. I said, yeah, but it's not nothing. This is slowing down. This is allowing voices to come in.
Yeah, and it's bringing into the space, making aware.
Yeah.
Just as a short tangent, how did the participants and the organizers react when they realized, okay, this is not a 15 minutes opening, it's taking 1.5 hours? And what was the impact on the conversations from that?
As the facilitator, if those conversations happen, I was not there because I already had the agenda B, because I already knew. So the rest of the facilitation team was already ready to work within a certain time frame that allowed for that to happen, Yeah. So that was so I think I just kept smiling and nodding, like, everything's fine, don't worry. And then we're all in that place. And I must say, like, the organizers was also like a group of women who were incredible and very, very sensitive. So, yeah.
Because I can imagine that nobody remains untouched.
No.
From something like that, especially if they've never experienced it. And then suddenly there's some context.
Yeah.
And maybe some urgency in the space.
And it happens in ways that it's exactly what you mentioned. It's not because people heard that they were like, now we have to do something. It's from inside out. So there was this, when like it dropped, like the energy level dropped to a level of presence. And this is like 150, 180 participants. And I could feel like there was something sacred happening at that moment, and people were just landing. And it's not cognitive. And then it's almost like someplace inside of them that's ancestral and that knows the land and knows they're a son or a daughter of the land, is awakened by that experience. And I know that has happened in other multilateral meetings and other type of like high stakes conversations and negotiations that happens in sacred land. And every land is sacred, but it happens in sacred land, that people are aware of the importance of doing that. And then you allow participants, again, by slowing down time, to be present in a different way. Yeah. And you bring dance, you bring music, you bring art, you bring walking in nature as a, after lunch activity, visioning. I heard from colleagues, they had sweat lodges, like shamanic sweat lodges and people do fires for storytelling, honoring their ancestors. And you can do that in Latin America, of course, have the Amazon. But if you have a summit also in the Lapland or in very northern parts of Europe, the Arctic, you also have the wisdom of the local indigenous people. And so it's everywhere.
Yeah. And especially in Europe, we often forget that.
Yeah.
And I parked the individuals and the emotions.
Yeah.
Quite a while ago. Get them out of the drawer. How do you allow the space, or where do you draw the line between the individual, the representative, allow the emotions in without diluting, or where is time and space for emotions and the individual, and where is time and space for the role and the representative?
Yeah. So I think process again becomes very important, right? So we're here talking about ground rules. Are people present as, their own person, or are they present as representatives? And if they're present as both, do they want to name it? Now I'm speaking with this hat. And process again, are you offering people hats that if they're speaking as a representative, they'll just take a cap? I've had, not me, I've seen this done before, that people had caps. And then you could know when they were speaking as representatives.
Beautiful. And it's making the implicit explicit.
Oh, yes. Totally explicit, exactly. Another thing that I find really important is, it's one thing if you're hosting a dialogue, And in dialogue, we're there to get to know each other, to exchange. There is no decision-making mandate. You can have an agenda for collaboration as an outcome, or topics that come up for further diving in. But if you have a summit and there is a decision-making power, making that power explicit, what is the mandate? How are we going to make decisions? Is it by consensus? Is it by consent? Is it 2/3 majority? Are we voting first? Are we voting as last resource? Do I have a right to disagree or to just leave a note on the final agreement that I disagree? And so in these settings, many times the decision making there is either a governance system in which the group is making recommendations for a council that will make a decision, or that will make the final recommendations for the policymakers, or you are going for consensus-based rules with the right to leave notes on things you disagree, let's say, right? And I find that for situations that include decision-making, that clarity about the mandate of the representative is really needed. Are they showing up with the power to make decisions, or are they going to go back to their, we say, capital, or to their company or to their organization to have a final approval? Because if that is clear, then we know what the representative is bringing forward, whether it's something they can stand by, or if it's just a bunch of ideas or part of brainstorming,
Yeah. And I was just thinking that many of the meetings happen with some sort of public or media there.
That's such a big, big issue, because we want to be transparent in many of the situations, and other situations we say no media today, no media until there is an agreement, or only media with an official statement that is approved by everyone. So it is a delicate one, because you really want to be transparent. So what I've seen work better and better, imagine processes in which you're developing energy policy or energy transition policy, for example. It's not a one-off meeting, right? So you have a bunch of meetings, and you start by diverging, creating multiple options, assessing the criteria for choice. Then you are choosing, then you are assessing the implications of the choices that were made, trade-offs, who loses, what is acceptable, not, and then you adopt or send it for adoption. So that could take 5 meetings, 4 meetings, and the whole process. So the idea is that in between meetings, there is always information that goes out to the public. And that's also how some of the parties that are not participating in those negotiations can influence, can lobby, can call, can, have their say. Because you never have a process in which everybody participates. You always have like 100, 150, 200 participants. So you may have 15 CSOs, NGOs participating, but from a universe of 200. So you have others that want to influence the process. And so what I find most exciting, and you can see that because I love this stuff, I love it, is when you do this type of design and this type of like multi-stakeholder processes, is that one of the indicators I have of success is that for every one thing that happens in the room, 9 things happen outside. So I facilitated this process in Brazil, 2014 and 15, about, it's called MAP, so it's Mitigation Action Planning Scenario. So long story short, it was about various options for mitigation in climate change in Brazil, and what were the implications of those policy choices for the economy and for social goals that Brazil had: employment, equality, gender equality, all of that. And what I saw happening is 150 people working in the room, 6 meetings, 1.5 year, a team of like 40 modelists developing the policy options, running the models and all of that. The Ministry of Environment picking up on the recommendations. But there were many like conflicts or disagreements between participants that were sometimes historical, like they had not seen eye to eye for like years. And then because they were working together on this, all kinds of different initiatives started popping up. A coalition on this, and the 23 industry organizations working on communique for Paris, and the NGOs developing a strategy for I don't know what. And of course, I cannot report to the donor that this is what happened because of this process, because there was a philanthropist financing this for the Ministry of Environment. But it was a big, big, big success, because the goal of the multi-stakeholder collaboration is to create change.
Yeah.
So if these people meet each other and trust each other and find ways to create even better outcomes for the country, the better.
Yeah. And that really further collaboration emerge through that. That maybe, and this also puts into perspective this one thing, because then even if that may fail, or maybe the outcome is not as glorious as we thought it would be, there are all these micro changes and opportunities.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's super exciting.
And then it's, interesting. This an absolute tangent could lead us to a different conversation, how to measure success. Because as you say, you don't report this to the donor or to the sponsor, and you cannot really follow up on that either, because it's out of your control or hands. And still, we might have our KPIs on how to measure success of these set of meetings.
Yeah.
There's so much beyond that. And I think there is a big parallel to organizations.
Precisely.
Where this could happen.
Yeah.
And then it's totally ignored. Huh.
Yeah. Sometimes you have a meeting in an organization that you're trying to decide on project X, but because of that meeting, other things got solved. Yeah. Or people who would not have met, sat down and created a new product, or
suddenly realize that they have more commonalities, or they have a shared vision on something else, and they take it into a different direction. Beautiful. What remains your facilitation challenge?
Yeah. What remains my facilitation challenge? I feel that the one thing that I've been working on ever since I started was devolving power. So that this idea of the torch is more and more and more embodied. Because I was a lawyer when I started, I felt everything was my responsibility. So I would over prepare and I would follow up with everyone and I would produce the best report the soonest so they wouldn't lose momentum. And now I work very strongly in identifying the people who are torch bearers, like in the group, who can be, whether there is a formal governance system or an informal one, who have the influence with the stakeholders to keep mobilizing for action, who want to take responsibility for co-creating the agendas, who will take this forward long after I'm gone. That is, power. We talk about power over, power with. I'm thinking of power through. So that ownership is really shared.
And what are your strategies then because it's relationship building, it's very strategic?
Yeah, it's strategic and at the same time clarity, right? That this is a goal. I don't do this. It's not a hidden agenda. Like from the beginning, I just say, well, this is your process. So I want to be able for you to understand this as much as you can from minute one. And I will be reaching out to people. And if you're interested to be one of the ambassadors or, torchbearers or something, just reach out and to make things, I'm very focused on making things as explicit as I can. Another thing that has been a goal of mine for a few years is also to have fun. Because if I just hang on to the heaviness of this work and what is at stake, it's high stakes facilitation. And like if we don't have a decent policy at the end, the world is going to end. And so for me, my Buddhist practice really helped me, like the idea of, like interconnectedness, that the earth is leading things and I'm just here working, that like, she's big and I'm small. That really kind of grounds me. I don't think I would be doing this work because I've burned out before. So for me to be able to do this work in a carrying only what's mine to carry, spirituality has been very important. Yeah.
And coming back to the resilience.
Yes.
And carry only what's yours to carry. Beautiful. And I think it's so difficult to distinguish sometimes because we get carried on. And then there's obviously our own vision and maybe activism or higher goals coming in.
And you've just named it. I think another thing has made a huge difference in my life as a facilitator doing this work is to have my consensus building community in which we have buddies and we can debrief processes. And then that is one of the questions. So who suffered there? Was it the facilitator you or the activist you? You're like, oh, welcome, activist me. There is no shame
For the
in that.
coaching
It's like,
question, yeah.
come, just have tea with me. I can see you're hurting. And that ability to hold that. Because there is, if you say there is neutrality, I don't think there is neutrality. I think there is impartiality and holding things in ways that I'm including every voice, or there is process in service of everyone and in service of the main outcome, right? But like all the time, I'm noticing my own beliefs and what I think. I'm also a climate expert, so what I think should be the way forward. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't do it this way. Let's see where it lands. But that self-compassion to just say, oh, the activist in me would have really liked this.
Yeah.
So I don't put that under the rug. It's really there. And sometimes at the end of the day, my inner activist does need a bubble bath because it's been a tough day. But the inner facilitator is really happy because what happened is what could have happened.
Yeah. I hear this self-awareness and humility and curiosity to stay open all the time and ask the questions. Thank you. Before I ask because I'm so curious and I'm watching the time, so before I ask my last questions, I would be curious, and maybe there is a nutshell to it. I think it could be a very long answer. Maybe there's a nutshell. How did you make the transition from your legal profession to becoming a coach and a facilitator, and now sounds as if you're living your dream?
Yeah, it's so beautiful to hear you say that because I really love what I do. So that is living the dream. And I find it kind of interesting because I do coach a lot of like CSO leaders. And these are folks that I end up finding in the room when I'm facilitating, or end up facilitating their teams or consortium or multi-stakeholder partnerships that they're involved in. And we end up meeting at the Sangha because we all find Buddhism in a certain way, or the Plum Village in a certain way. So it's very funny. And I'm one of those people that really trusts that the universe, like whatever you're looking for is looking for you. So in that sense, I have many memories of moments that I was supposed to turn right, but then I turned left, and at the left, there was what was, expecting me. But a turning point in my life for sure was this course that I mentioned in the Netherlands in 2008. That was when I was introduced to interest-based negotiations. That was my first facilitation training. It was 1.5 hour facilitation training.
And you were still a lawyer back then?
I was still a lawyer working carbon credits contracts. And I had just come out of the UN. And I remember in one of the simulations, because when you learn negotiations that way, there is a lot of simulations and role playing. I was the chair in the game. Pablo Burford is the name of the game. It's groundwater contamination in a bordering 2 countries that are bordering. And I was sharing in the meeting, and it was just the beginning of the meeting, and I was listening initial opening statements and holding the pen and the flip chart. And I remember this one participant looking at me, and I was writing down his words, and I looked at him and I said, I'll never forget Nestor, his name. And I said, Nestor, does this capture what you just said? And he looked at me, and his eyes, there was just trust. And his eyes said, that's exactly what I said I need. Those are my needs. Thank you. And I remember feeling like, please, God, can I do this for the rest of my life? For me, it was so powerful because I was like, if my work is to be trusted with other people's words and to help them bring their voice into the space, this is sacred work. I want to do this for the rest of my life. I felt like, somebody's sharing a secret, although that was a public thing, right? They were saying what they needed in front of everybody. So I think from that moment on, I did more facilitation trainings. And then I just started telling clients, like, can I facilitate this meeting when you're... So instead of just taking the brief that they had for that particular, I was working on sustainability, especially corporate sustainability. And instead of just taking the brief and the client would have had the meeting with multiple people in the organization, I would say, can I join that meeting? Can I see if I can facilitate that conversation to see what comes up? And that's how I started kind of doing it. And I became more and more interested in helping the conversations happen, then doing the content work, then writing the strategies for them. And so that was, yeah. And then a few years later, maybe 2 or 3 years later from that experience, I was working as the climate director on the business school. We had the sustainability center, and there was this one meeting. And then one of the participants was really upset about the conclusions of the report that was being presented. And they were going to walk out. But this was like one of the main parties that we needed to influence as a sustainability center. And I just remember I walked in, there was a colleague presenting the outcomes of the report, and I said, can I just do something here? And everybody's like, the person is very upset. My colleague said, sure. And I said, can I transform the points you're making into questions? And the person looked at me and said, sure. Okay, so let me help reframe what you just said. For example, this study is bullshit because it doesn't do that. Does this study cover the sources of income in a transparent and fair way? It's like, oh, that is exactly what I was saying. And so I transformed all the points in like 15 questions. And this person stayed through the end of the meeting, And so I think those are the moments that, that for everybody else and for myself, I was like, I am a facilitator. I'm here to make things easier.
Yeah.
Not a difficultator. I'm a facilitator.
I'm so glad I asked the question. Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
beautiful. And what I hear is you crafting your own career change by creating opportunities for yourself to practice the skill and to create value through this new skill.
Yeah, and being invited by colleagues as well. Many people open doors, and I said, can I just come and help? Can I come and facilitate? Can I do a session? Can I do this? Yeah.
Beautiful.
I think I just took the chance, and then the rest is history somehow. And then, and really working with incredible people. Yeah, I guess. And being completely fascinated by design, the process design that's my legal mind, I think, So from beginning to end, can I design something super exciting? Yeah.
So what is it that you would tell your former self or that you wished you had known before?
Honestly, that the sky is the limit. Yeah. Really listen to your heart and what you want to facilitate and desire, and trust that what you're looking for is looking for you. Yeah.
Mic dropping moment. Thank you so much, Barbara, for this glimpse into a different world with such clarity and precision and guidance. Thank you. Learned a lot.
Thank you for the opportunity and for saying yes. And for inviting my experience and these stories in, and may that be to the benefit of all beings on earth. That's what I wish for. Thank you.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.